The Cardinals were a troubled team at the All-Star break. The addition of Lou Brock had added a badly needed spark and given them a new dimension of speed. But as a club, they were still faltering. They were 1 game under 500 and 10 games behind Philadelphia. At the beginning of the season, the Cardinal players had felt that they could beat the Phillies in head-to-head competition and that they were a better team. The Cardinals decided they had to make their move at the All-Star break. They were still, Bing Devine thought, incomplete as a team. Both their power hitters were infielders, and they were falling short in getting sufficient power from the usual source, the outfielders. They were using something of a patchwork combination in right, so Devine decided to call up a young outfielder named Mike Shannon. He was 24, a big, strong local boy who signed with the Cardinals in 1958 after playing quarterback with the University of Missouri freshman football team. Because he was a local boy, the Cardinals had watched him grow up, and they took him into Busch Stadium for a tryout. It was a day on which Shannon, who was built more like a tight end than a quarterback, simply hammered the ball. Devine had asked Hutchinson what he thought, and Hutch had said, "Lock the goddamn door and don't let him out till we sign him." The Cardinals, Shannon thought, were very good to him. They moved him up quickly, letting him skip a classification every year. In 1964, they called him up, Bing Devine said, to make their outfield complete. They were not thinking batting average, for he was hitting only .278 in Jacksonville, but he was a very good defensive player with one of the best arms in the league, and he would hit for power, they thought. But the Cardinals were still far back and had not shown any signs of making a pennant run. There was no doubt that the tension and frustration on the team were mounting. Bob Bragg, who was the sports editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, was traveling with the team, and since it was the midpoint of the season, he decided to ask the Cardinal players what they thought was wrong. Some of them did not want to talk, but Bill White, the first baseman, was quite willing to talk for the record. What was wrong with the team, he said, was himself. He was supposed to be one of the 2 power hitters on the team, along with Ken Boyer, and he was not doing the job. There was a reason for White's problems. He had hurt his left shoulder during the off-season doing exercises. Perhaps he decided years later, inflicting some damage to the rotator cuff. From the start, in part because of his intelligence and his inner strength, he had been a leader among the black players, and not merely on his own team. White was an impressive man physically, so powerfully built that some of his teammates marveled that someone so big and strong and potentially muscle-bound could get around on the ball so quickly with his bat. He was exceptionally fair-minded and, as such, an immensely valuable teammate. He understood almost perfectly the historic moment when the black players had finally arrived, how much was invested in them on the part of those who had never had a chance to succeed and those who might come after. And he was determined that he and those blacks around him would use this great moment not just to play well, but to make an even larger statement about black purpose and black ability. He was unsparing in his judgments about himself and the other black players. Long after Solly Hemus had been fired, he was capable of getting on Bob Gibson if Gibson was having trouble with his control. White was born in the Florida Panhandle in 1934, but came north to Warren, Ohio as an infant. Growing up, he remembered the singular forcefulness of his grandmother. In her politics and her attitude toward white people, she was, he recalled later, not unlike the black Muslims who surfaced in the 60s. She was determined that no one in her family was going to slip into the failure and degradation that she believed whites had deliberately inflicted on black people. In 1952, when he was 18, Bill White caught the eye of a scout named Alan Fay at an amateur tournament and was recommended to the New York Giants. After his first spring training in Phoenix, he went off to play with the Burlington Graham team in the Carolina League. It was Class B ball, and it was a testimonial to the insensitivity of the men who ran baseball in those days that they did to Bill White what they did to so many young black players at that time. Instead of letting him play on one of their farm teams north of the Mason-Dixon line, they sent him not merely to the south, but to a tiny town with not even the marginal protection offered by an urban setting. White was not just the only black player on his team, he was the only black player in the league that year. It was 1953, the year before the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The South was already afire with much angry talk about the coming of Northern integrationists. but the only integrationist around that year was Bill White. Somehow, after that season, it seemed to get easier in his career, perhaps because he had been through the worst. Besides, some of his teammates, even the Southern boys, had been very good and rallied to him. After 1956, he went into the Army for 2 years, and when he came back, the Giants seemed to have an abundance of big, powerful black first basemen, like Orlando Cepeda and Willie McCovey. He asked the Giants to trade him. Eddie Stanky had scouted him for the Cardinals before the trade and enthusiastically endorsed the idea of picking him up. He did well in St. Louis. By July of that first year, White was hitting over .360, and he made the All-Star team. White's bat was critical to the Cardinal team, but the 1964 season was turning into a disaster because of his shoulder injury. While he was in New York, he became friendly with Bob Boyle when Boyle had written a wonderful piece on the last black barnstorming tour for Sports Illustrated. Boyle sent him to a distinguished orthopedic surgeon named Hans Krause. Krause was famous, having helped treat John Kennedy for his chronic back problems. Dr. Krause immediately gave him a shot. Unlike the team doctor, who had targeted an area in front of the shoulder, Dr. Krause went after a spot in the back, and White felt immediate relief. A few days later, in a doubleheader in Pittsburgh, White celebrated by getting 6 hits, including 2 home runs, and knocking in 5 runs. The Cardinals swept the series. A critical piece had been restored to the Cardinal lineup. Jim Bouton was having a hard time pitching in the early summer. His back had been hurting constantly since the spring, and he was not able to throw his fastball with full force. Bouton was a power pitcher without a power pitcher's body. In his own words, he was a Volkswagen at the Indianapolis 500. His fastball was, at best, in the low 90s. Other, bigger pitchers might encounter physical problems, but they would be strong enough to pitch their way through them. With Bouton, there was no buffer zone. Everything had to be perfect. Then, in mid-season, his shoulder and back began to feel better. His body was somehow healing itself. Later, he was diagnosed as having had a low-grade chronic strain of the brachialis muscle, which attaches the biceps to the bone. This injury would, in any real sense, end his career as a power pitcher the next season. He was well aware of his tenuous position as a star major league pitcher. He was, as much as anyone, the first fan as player, a teammate once told him. Someone for whom being a major leaguer was an unlikely, indeed almost giddy experience. It was not surprising that when his career was over, he became not a coach but a writer. He had always had to work hard at being a baseball player. He barely made his high school team. Only in his senior year had he been able to pitch, and until then his nickname had been Warm-Up Bouton. He was a walk-on player in western Michigan, but then in the summer he played for a very good team in an amateur league in Chicago, the Cook's Sportscraft. Even here his career did not look bright. He was their number 4 pitcher. Until the National Amateur Championship in Battle Creek, Michigan. The place was loaded with scouts, and that day Bouton pitched the single best game of his life, striking out 10, and after the game the scouts swarmed over him. He found himself starting the 1959 season with the Yankee Class D team at Auburn. He had begun to notice that, although the other young pitchers with him were taller, stronger, and far better credentialed, they seemed emotionally vulnerable. That vulnerability, he thought, came from the easy early successes in their lives, when they had almost always been the biggest and strongest players among their boyhood peers. When their talent alone no longer carried them, they were not as smart about making adjustments, about listening to older pitchers who might teach them a new pitch. Whatever else, that was not Jim Bouton's problem. In 1960, he was sent to Greensboro in the Class B League. He pitched well there. In 1962, he went to spring training for a second time. There he picked up an additional bit of advice, ironically from a pitcher he did not particularly like, named Jim Coates. The managers traditionally told the rookie pitchers to go out there and throw soft so that the veteran hitters could work on their timing. Coates said that was nonsense. Be selfish, he said. Go out there and throw as hard as you can and throw your best stuff. The other pitchers noticed that Maris, Mantle, Yogi, and some of the other veteran players were quietly cursing him during batting practice, but that only made him throw harder and harder. Ralph Houck, on the other hand, was quietly smiling. Bouton made the Major League roster in 1962 by the skin of his teeth. Late July was a bad time for the Cardinals. Bill White had begun to hit, and Lou Brock was playing so well that Bing Devine had already decided that the Broglio-Brock trade was the best of his life, but they were still playing .500 ball. On July 21st, they played a 3-game series at home with the Pirates and lost all 3 games. The defeat gave the Cardinals a record of 47-48 and left them tied for 7th place, 10 games behind the Phillies. But they went on to win the next 3 games in Philadelphia. It was the beginning of what at first seemed the slowest of comebacks. In Gibson's start against the Cubs, he was hit hard, lasting only 6 innings. Keane told reporters afterward that he had no idea what was wrong with Gibson. "He's just not pitching," Keane said. By late July, Gibson was very edgy. His record was now 8-8, and his earned run average was ballooning upward. Gradually, during the month of August, Gibson began to work back toward his groove. McCarver watched his friend struggle that month and kept his distance. He learned early on when to approach Gibson and when not to. They were becoming in that season not just teammates, but friends. They were 2 of the strongest players on the team, and each was just coming of age. McCarver was the white son of a policeman in Memphis, one of the most segregated cities in the South. He was a raw and passionate athlete, driven to succeed no less than Gibson was. Their relationship did not start well. There was from the start the powerful but invisible difference in the way that the white society in those days treated a white boy like McCarver as a local hero. McCarver, a high school athlete hero, signed up with the Cardinals for a bonus of $75,000 and moved up quickly through the Cardinal organization. Gibson resented that in the light of his signing bonus of $4,000. McCarver first came up in 1959. Young and unsure of himself, he was raw meat for Gibson. But the more Gibson teased McCarver, the more secure their friendship became. By the middle of the 1964 season, McCarver knew that he had earned Gibson's respect as a professional baseball player. The Yankee scout first saw the young pitcher in 1959 at a high school all-star game in New Jersey, and he liked what he saw: an incredibly smooth delivery and an exceptional natural fastball. He went over to the boy, who was soon to be 18, and who turned out to be well-spoken and thoughtful. It was a scene almost as old as professional baseball, but now there was a twist to it. Both the boy and the scout were black, and the scout was working for the New York Yankees. The boy's name was Al Downing, and in time he would become the first black pitcher for the Yankees. The scout's name was Bill Yancey, and he would one day enter both the Negro Baseball Hall of Fame in Kansas City, Missouri, and the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts. Denied the chance to play in both leagues, Yancey had become a professional scout. The Yankees were the right organization for him, Yancey thought, not just because they were ready to correct their lack of black players, but also because Downing was a left-hander, and the Yankees always needed left-handers in that park. He got Downing a bonus of $16,000. He could have gotten him a little more, he told the boy, but he preferred to use his extra leverage to start Downing a little higher in the Yankee farm system. Yancey was trying to minimize the years Downing would have to play in small southern towns. He pitched for the first time in 1961 in Binghamton, and he did very well. In mid-July, with his record 9-1, he was called up to the Major League club. Downing called Yancey to tell him what he thought was the good news, but Yancey was furious. As far as he was concerned, it was the worst thing that could happen to a gifted young player. He had not learned to deal with adversity. He was at the stage where pure talent was not enough. Al Downing pitched against Washington and got knocked out in the first inning. It had nothing to do with talent. It was all about his knowledge of pitching. He had never been in real trouble in the minor leagues, so when he got in trouble in the majors, he did not know what to do. Later in the year, he was sent down to Richmond, and for a time he struggled. Slowly his confidence came back. By the end of the '62 season, he felt he was ready for the major leagues. During that rookie season of 1963, Downing truly arrived and went 13-5. The old Yankee magic was not working. The other American League teams no longer rolled over and played dead for them. Moreover, they were paying much more heavily for George Weiss's racism than anyone had realized at the time. Weiss did not think that his white customers wanted to sit with black fans, and he did not think his white players wanted to play with blacks. And worst of all, he did not in his heart believe that black players were as good as white ones. That, thought Leonard Coppett, who had covered the team for many years for the New York Post and in 1964 for the New York Times, was his single biggest mistake. George Weiss did not understand the kind of player he had always sought out in the past. The tough kid who was as much warrior as baseball player was now, more often than not, black. The Yankees were not a team that would have signed a Bob Gibson, for Gibson would have been too threatening to many of the people in management. It was no surprise that when the Yankees finally brought up a black player, it was Ellie Howard, a talented, immensely hard-working player without the speed that marked the new generation of black stars. When Howard first arrived, Casey Stengel pronounced, "I got the one who can't run." Ellie Howard came up in 1955. He was the perfect player to break the Yankee color line. He had a sweet disposition and the capacity to bury deep within himself the racial wounds inflicted by society. He was a man of the older generation, and his strength manifested itself in his ability not to show his rage. He had grown up in St. Louis and went, inevitably, to the Kansas City Monarchs, the star team of the Negro Leagues, where manager Buck O'Neill thought him an exceptional player and an uncommonly decent man. A few years later, a number of teams came after Howard. Buck O'Neill carefully shepherded him to the Yankees. Within the world of black baseball, the honor of being the first black to play for the Yankees was considerable, and O'Neill wanted him to be a Monarch. He thought Howard was mature and strong and was sure he could handle this demanding role. Years later, after Howard died quite young of a stroke, his widow, Arlene, would rage about the injustices of those years and how she believed that repressing his rage had damaged his health. They both hated the fact that he was always under scrutiny, that his behavior and his manner had to be so much better than those of everyone else. She was enraged when, rather late in his minor league career, when he was 24 and already in Triple-A ball, the Yankees decided to turn him into a catcher. She was convinced that it was racist, in some unconscious way at least. But he merely waved her objections aside, for he wanted to be a Yankee. He loved the aura of the team. At first he had felt alone, but in general his teammates accepted him. Phil Rizzuto and Bill Skowron were particularly helpful, and the Fords, Whitey and Jones, seemed oblivious to color. Mickey Mantle was Mickey, generous to all. By 1964 he was probably the team's best player, admired and respected by all his teammates. The year before he had been the league's most valuable player. If it had not been for the issue of color, he would have been a far better choice to succeed Houck as manager than Berra. But Major League Baseball, let alone the Yankees, was still more than a decade away from letting a black man manage white players. The Yankees were clearly in trouble. At one point, the starting Yankee outfield of Mantle, Maris, and Tom Tresh was so banged up that all three were limping. Once, when they came into the dugout from the outfield, Mantle looked around and said, "All we need now is a flag and a drum." Pitchers Ralph Terry and Jim Bouton were still bothered by their sore arms. Pete Mickelson, with his heavy sinker, more than justified Berra's decision to choose him over Metcalf, but by midseason, Berra already had a reputation for misusing his bullpen, for getting his pitchers up too early and too often. By midseason, Steve Hamilton, who had had a record of 7-0 at one point, largely as a reliever, had a sore arm and was unable to pitch for almost a month. He had been used too often. Most ominous of all, the other pitchers suspected, was the condition of Whitey Ford. That year, Ford was pitching on guile, control, and pure courage. His arm hurt all the time, and on occasion, when he would go out to warm up, he would have nothing. His ball had no movement and little speed. By early August, not only was Ford's arm giving him trouble, so was his right hip. Yogi Berra, wrote one of the sports writers, had better learn how to spell Stottlemyre, the name of the young pitcher playing so well in Richmond. Curt Simmons was a vital part of the Cardinals, the veteran pitcher who had seen it all on a staff where both Sadecki and Gibson were still defining themselves. Baseball was life, and life was baseball for him. Curt Simmons saw life through the prism of baseball. If someone was coming on hard times maritally or had a lot of debt, the count in life was 0-2. If things were going well for him and he was on a roll, then he was going through life with a count on him 3-0. There was nothing mysterious about what he was going to do when he pitched. He was going to keep the ball low and away or up and in and try to keep the hitters from seeing anything good. Simmons no longer had his blazing fastball, but he had a good fast curve, a good slow curve, a good changeup, and just enough of a fastball to keep hitters off balance. To beat Curt Simmons in 1964, when he was 35 and in his 17th season, the hitter had to be very smart and very patient. He had a great herky-jerky motion that threw hitters off, and because he did not throw that hard anymore, there was a perception that he was beatable. He was, but it was harder than it seemed. The last thing Simmons thought he was going to see in this season was a pennant race. It struck him that his best chance for a World Series had come and gone in 1950, when he was a star on the Phillies' Whiz Kid team of that era. Unfortunately, he had been in a National Guard unit that was called up late in the season for the Korean War. Now, in midseason, he was pitching as well as he ever had, and he specialized in tormenting his old team, going 10-9 against the Phillies as a Cardinal. On July 30th, Johnny Keane gave the call to bring Barney Schultz back to the parent club. Barney Schultz was doing the best pitching of his life in Jacksonville, with an earned run average under 1. On August 1st, he pitched for the first time in relief of Bob Gibson. Of the remaining 59 games left on the Cardinals' schedule, he pitched in 30 of them. He was an odd figure, a young old man, more like a rookie than a veteran, extremely experienced on the field and equally tentative off it. Curt Simmons had known him on the Phillies, had hung out with him in St. Louis, and seemed to be in charge of him. The mother hen, they called Simmons. There was something very poignant, they thought, about a man getting a shot like this so late in his career. And from the start, Schultz was helping the club with his knuckler, which seemed unhittable this season. The call from New York for Mel Stottlemyre came on August 10th. By this time, Whitey Ford had gone to the bullpen, Jim Bouton was fighting pain in his throwing arm, and Al Downing was still somewhat erratic. When Stottlemyre went to work for the first time as a New York Yankee, the Yankees were in third place, 3.5 games out of first. No one reached out to him more readily in those first days than the catcher, Elston Howard. Pitch the way you did in Richmond. Don't change anything. Don't try and do more because you're here and you're pitching to major leaguers. Don't try and throw faster. Do what you did there, and you'll be fine, Howard said. That day, in his first major league appearance, he was everything management and his teammates had hoped for. He was the coolest rookie that others had ever seen. The other players, particularly the other young players, were in awe of him from the start. Here he was, a kid just out of the minor leagues, walking into the starting rotation of a defending championship team in the middle of a pennant race, and he was as relaxed as could be. In that first game against the White Sox, 21 batters hit ground balls, and he walked only 1. The Yankees won 7-3. Stottlemyre's first victory was a lovely blend of the old and the new. In the 4th inning, Mantle came up with a right-handed Ray Herbert pitching for Chicago and hit a tremendous drive to center field. The ball was officially judged to be 502 feet. It may have been the longest ball Mantle ever hit to center field in the stadium. Stottlemyre was in awe. Mantle was relaxed after the game, almost boyishly happy. The measuring of Mantle's home runs began in 1953 when he hit a tremendous drive against the Washington Senators that had gone out of Griffith Stadium. Red Patterson, the Yankee press officer, decided to measure it, which he did by walking it off rather than using a tape, and he estimated it had gone 565 feet. The inner world of baseball was very macho. The clearest measure of macho for a pitcher was the speed of his fastball, and for a hitter it was the length of his home runs. One of Mantle's great goals was one that mortal men dared not even think about, to be the first player ever to hit a fair ball out of Yankee Stadium. That would set him apart for all time. He never did it, but he came very close. Now, in 1964, his body badly worn down, he still believed that one day he might drive a ball out of the stadium. In mid-August, Bob Gibson started to find his groove, but whatever run Gibson and the Cardinals made now, it was going to come too late to help Bing Devine. From the start, he had been vulnerable to Branch Rickey. He had fired people himself, of course. It was part of the game. He remembered having to fire Fred Hutchinson on Bush's order when he didn't want to. It was a painful moment. Devine was replaced by Bob Howson, Rickey's partner in a recent attempt to start a new baseball league. When the firing took place, the Cardinals were 9 games behind. That they began to make a run at the pennant now was bittersweet for Devine. Suddenly all the pieces had come together, and all of the players were playing up to their full potential. Devine went quietly. It was something he had always expected. He had been dealing for the last 7 years from a position of limited strength, and the pressure to produce a winner had grown every year. The only question in Devine's mind was whether Johnny Keane would go too, or whether he could last out the season. At this point, there was an exceptional balance between the younger and older players on the team. The younger players were all coming of age in those years, Tim McCarver later noted, harnessing their abilities, learning to deal with their frustrations and anger, and coming to terms with what they could and could not do as big leaguers. If you were going to grow up in baseball, then the opportunity to do it with older players such as White, Boyer, and Grote was a great advantage. They typified the best of the older generation of baseball players. For the young pitchers looking for a role model, there was Curt Simmons. If he had a single goal in life, it was to keep the game simple. In the years to come, Tim McCarver realized that the players of his generation were growing up in an unusually strong and highly professional environment. The Cardinal system still emphasized serious teaching in its instructional leagues and camps. They were also being taught not just to be baseball players, but how to be honorable men. Codes were learned, rules of conduct were enforced. Most of all, McCarver came to understand how the growing-up process took place in his own case. The older players worked deftly to teach him how to control his anger and discipline himself and his ego, so that he managed to keep his competitive fire without becoming self-destructive. When McCarver's batting average hovered around .270 in his early years, he raged against his fate and did not readily accept the limitations of his place among more talented and experienced hitters. So when he tried to smash a bat against a wall after making an out in a big game, it was not Johnny Keane who talked to him, but the veteran players who took him aside and made him understand that the tirade jeopardized not just himself, but that by risking injury he was jeopardizing his teammates. Ken Boyer helped him to come to terms with himself as much as anyone on the team. Boyer had come into the league as a kid when the best player on the team had been Stan Musial, and he had learned from Musial to study the game. Musial was a great player, a decent human being, and he treated everyone well. In some ways, Boyer was passing Musial's lessons to another generation. He played hurt all the time, and he never complained about his injuries. Mike Shannon remembered Boyer coming into the clubhouse one day, clearly in such great pain that he was having trouble getting his arm into his uniform. When Shannon looked questioningly at Boyer as if to ask if he could play, Boyer smiled and asked, "You know any other place where I can go out and get a job that pays $50,000 a year?" It was not always easy for Ken Boyer playing in St. Louis. The other Cardinal players believed that Harry Carey, the immensely popular local announcer, rode Boyer unfairly. For much of his career, Boyer was booed at home, and the source of that booing, the other Cardinal players were sure, was Carey. They believed it came from a moment when Carey had wanted to experiment by doing an interview with Boyer during a game. Boyer had said no, but perhaps when the game was over. They had apparently exchanged harsh words. It was easy for Boyer to keep his perspective. The Boyers had grown up very poor in rural Missouri. Ken and his brother Cleet, who played third base for the Yankees, were raised in a small house with no electricity and no plumbing. The highest calling was to be a professional baseball player, but even better was to be a Cardinal. Both Ken Boyer and his older brother Cloyd signed with the Cardinals. Slowly, over the previous few years, a certain culture had evolved on the Cardinal team, not unlike that which had existed on the great Yankee teams in the past, and men like Boyer, Gibson, Flood, Grote, and White were instrumental in creating it. Individual statistics and goals were sacrificed for team objectives. By the last third of the 1964 season, They had come together. Johnny Keane knew from the moment Bing Devine was fired that he was hanging on by his fingernails. It almost did not seem to matter to Keane, some of his friends thought. He was so angry at the way Bush had treated Devine that he seemed to lose his taste for the job. On August 15th, the Cardinals played the Los Angeles Dodgers in Los Angeles, and Gibson lost 4-3. Gibson was furious. He had been pitching well for much of the month, and then on this evening he had pitched well and still lost. It was exactly the kind of game he hated to lose, to come out of a game with a lead, to turn over his work to a relief pitcher, and then to see the game slip away. On August 24th, Gibson pitched against Pittsburgh in the first game of a home stand. In that game he was completely in charge. He struck out 12 and walked only 2. He seemed to be getting stronger as the game went along, and in both the 6th and the 7th innings he struck out the side. That made his record 11-10. And with that he went on a roll and won his next 5 games, all of them complete, allowing on the average 1 earned run a game. That, he thought, was more like it. With Gibson pitching well again, suddenly the Cardinals were a different team. Because he was such a force, they became stronger. He brought an additional factor to each game now, and that was intimidation. His game face was a cold and angry mask, one that seemed to show no mercy to the batter. There was a mystique to him, and he orchestrated it very deliberately. He hated coming out of a game for a relief pitcher. It was not just a matter of pride to finish what he himself had started, it was a matter of control. He did not trust others to do for him what he felt he could do better for himself. Over one stunning 10-year period, starting in 1963, he completed at least 20 starts a season, a figure virtually unheard of in contemporary baseball. He wanted the ball back from McCarver as quickly as the catcher could deliver, and he was in his motion, rocking back and forth even as McCarver flashed the sign. His veteran teammate Roger Craig thought there was a certain genius to Gibson's authority when he was on the mound, and the speed with which he pitched was a critical part of it. It intimidated the hitter, who could never get set and never had time to guess what was coming. If McCarver came out to the mound to talk to him, it was only because Johnny Keane had ordered him to go out. He would still be 5 or 6 yards away when Gibson would wave him off. "What the hell are you doing out here? Get the hell back behind the plate where you belong. The only thing you know about pitching is that you can't hit." He was a man who lifted an entire team. His own standards were so high that the other players did not like to let him down, and they played harder when he pitched. In time, this became true on the other days as well. There had been rumors for more than a year that the Yankees were for sale. On August 13th, the news leaked out that the Yankees had been sold to CBS. It was a 2-part sale. In Stage 1, they bought 80% for $11.2 million with an option to buy the remaining 20%. Nothing better demonstrated the changing economics of sports in general and baseball in particular than the sale of the Yankees, for it reflected both the rising value of a team and the increasing importance of television in sports. By mid-August, it was a 3-way American League pennant race. Baltimore was on the rise. More and more, the Yankees seemed patched together and carried by memories. On August 17th, in 3rd place and 2.5 games behind Baltimore, they went to Chicago for a 4-game series. It was a disaster. They were 4.5 games back and sinking, it seemed. One thing happened during that period that seriously affected the pennant race. Boog Powell, the young power hitter of the Baltimore Orioles, who already had 31 homers that season, hurt his wrist. The Orioles played 14 games when he was out and split them. At the very least, the injury slowed down what appeared to be a serious Baltimore stretch drive. Some of the Oriole and Yankee players thought that if Powell had not been injured, Baltimore would have won the pennant. The fact that Tony Kubek had missed most of the Chicago series at shortstop underlined a glaring vulnerability and an important change in the Yankees, a decline in the depth of the team, particularly among the middle infielders. When Houck took over as manager in 1961, he wanted to stabilize the team and believed he could do it by putting Kubek at shortstop every day and Bobby Richardson at second, and not shifting them around. With that, Kubek and Richardson became the core of the infield. They were a very good double play combination, quite possibly the best in the league. Kubek liked and responded to challenges. Early on, he had heard people say that he would never be a big league shortstop, and with that he set out to be the best shortstop in the league. In 1964, Kubek was experiencing constant back problems. In the past, the Yankees had been so deep that the loss of a player like Kubek would not have seemed that important. In 1964, Kubek's injuries meant that Phil Linz had to play more and more shortstop that season, and that he had almost as many at-bats as Kubek. Linz was a good baseball player in the eyes of his teammates, but he himself was the first to point out he was not Kubek. On September 4th, the Yankees went on a 5-game winning streak. Then they hit another bump in the road and lost 2 out of 3. On September 12th, Stottlemyre, who was absolutely brilliant down the stretch, beat Minnesota 4-3 on a 5-hitter, and it was the first game of another winning streak. When the second streak was over, the Yankees had won 19 out of their last 22 and were in first place by 4 games. As the National League race became tighter, the Yankees seemed to be putting a lock on the American League. Their 2 competitors, the Orioles and the White Sox, were younger teams, and they simply flattened out. Baltimore, which actually had a season edge over the Yankees that year, went 11-11 during the Yankee hot streak, and the White Sox went 10-9. Most of the Yankee hitters went on batting streaks of their own. Ellie Howard went 17 for 42 during the streak, and Bobby Richardson went 21 for 54. But if there was a key player, both offensively and defensively, in that stretch for the Yankees, it was Roger Maris. With both Mantle and Tom Tresh frequently injured, Roger Maris, who had not been that dangerous a hitter for 2 years, caught fire and played some of the best baseball of his life. He went 16 for 42 during that critical winning streak and drove in critical runs in game after game, 24 runs in his last 41 games. In addition, Berra, finally accepting the inevitability of Mantle's physical decline, decided to play Maris in center field. Maris, fast and strong, played the best center field the Yankees had seen since Mantle was young. At first it seemed a small thing. On Sunday, September 29th, Tony Kubek had a frustrating day at the plate. After this game, he apparently slapped his hand against a door that appeared to him to be made of wood. It was metal, and he badly hurt his wrist. Kubek did not play again for the rest of the season and did not play in the World Series. That September, after leading the National League for almost the entire season, often by as many as 9 or 10 games, the Philadelphia Phillies began to die. On September 20th, the Phillies were 90-60 with 12 games to play and with a 6.5-game lead over the rest of the league. Cincinnati was in second, and by then a half game behind them was St. Louis. With that, the Phillies came home for a 7-game homestand, absolutely sure they could clinch the pennant. On September 21st, the first game of the Phillies series against the Reds won 1-0. The Philly lead was now 5.5 games. They lost the next 2 in the series to the Reds. The incredible shrinking Philly lead was now 3.5. Philadelphia then took on Milwaukee and lost all 4 games. The streaking Cincinnati Reds were in first place with a record of 91-66. The Phillies were in second, 1 game out, with a record of 90-67. And the Cardinals were in third, 89-67, 1.5 games out. The Phillies had played their entire 7-game homestand without a victory. On Monday, September 28th, the Phillies went into St. Louis for a 3-game series. Suddenly, the schedule, if anything, seemed to favor the Cardinals. The Cards got 3 shots at home against the stumbling Philadelphia team, and then they closed out the season with 3 games against the Mets, while the Reds finished up with the Pirates. Obscured by the assault that the Reds had just made against the Phillies was the fact that the Cards were a hot team, too. The Cards had started their last-minute pennant run on September 22nd, when they went to New York to play 2 games against the Mets, and from there to Pittsburgh to play 5 against the Pirates. Bob Skinner, the old Pirate outfielder who had been traded that season to the Cards, and Dick Groat decided they needed to sweep the Mets and then take 4 out of 5 against the Pirates. It was a tall order because Pittsburgh was a tough team. They ended up splitting with the Mets. "Okay, Dick, the only thing we have to do is sweep the Pirates in 5, Skinner said. And they went on to do just that. When the 3-game Philly-Cardinals series started in St. Louis, the Cardinal players, as befit a team doing everything right, were confident and exuberant. Rarely had baseball been so much fun. They raced right through it. There was a strong sense of camaraderie and a wonderful balance of personalities, the players decided, looking back years later. Bob Uecker, who was one of the last people Devine had picked up, was turning out to be not only a valuable player, a good catcher with a good arm, but also a valuable addition to the team, and he helped keep his teammates loose. He was someone who thought baseball should be fun. In Cincinnati, the Pirates ended the Reds' 9-game streak. The Phillies seemed finished after the series with the Cardinals. It was their 10th loss in a row. That Wednesday night, the Cardinal players went out to the pool at the Bel Air East, where many of the unmarried players were staying, and listened to the broadcast of the Reds-Pirates game from Cincinnati. At the end of Wednesday's schedule, for the first time, the Cardinals had first place to themselves. But on Thursday, the Reds beat the Pirates to cut the Cardinal lead to a half game. It should have been easy for the Cardinals. All they had to do was beat the Mets, and the pennant was theirs. The Mets won 1-0. In Cincinnati, the Phillies beat the Reds. Then the Cardinals lost their second game to the Mets. If the Reds lost to the Phillies and the Cards lost to the Mets on the final day, the major leagues for the first time in history would have a 3-way tie. In Cincinnati, the Phillies defeated the Reds. The Cardinals in St. Louis defeated the Mets. The Cardinals won the pennant on the last day of the season. On October 3rd, the Yankees clinched the pennant at home against Cleveland. There was, of course, some apprehension among the Cardinals about playing the mighty Yankees. The Yankees had been to the World Series every season since time began, it seemed, and they knew about big games. In fact, the Cardinals could still hardly believe they were in the World Series. On the day of the first game, Bob Uecker was shagging balls out in left field with some of the other scrubs. In order to mark the festivities, 3 Dixieland bands were stationed there, and at one point they took a break and put down their instruments. Uecker wandered over and picked up a tuba. Just then someone hit a slow, lazy fly out to left. Instinctively, because he was born to be a comic, Uecker circled under the ball with a tuba, but missed. The next one he caught. Then he missed one. The players began to laugh, and the crowd began to cheer. Some of the balls dented the tuba, and the owner was not amused, sending the Cardinals and Uecker a bill for $250. His teammates, though, were delighted. It was the World Series against the mighty Yankees, and the Cardinals were very relaxed. Because Gibson had pitched so much at the end of the season, there had been no chance to rest him, so they opened with Ray Sadecki, who, true to his own projections, had been a 20-game winner. He was pitching against Whitey Ford, who, despite injuries and declining physical ability, had nonetheless managed a record of 17-6 with an ERA of 2.13. In the first inning, there was a critical play. With one out, Brock singled. Then Grote singled to right, and Brock kept going without hesitation to third. It was something he had thought about before the game, testing Mantle. The Cardinal book on the Yankees said that they could run on Mantle, and now they started to do it, almost from the moment the game began. It was an early sign not just of his own physical decline, but that the Cardinals were the younger, faster, more aggressive team. Brock had come in to score when Boyer flied to Mantle. Sadecki was not sharp that day. In the second inning, Elston Howard singled, and then Tresh, a good high fastball hitter, hit a tremendous drive into the left center field bleachers.